Thank you, Guillaume. And just for everyone to know, Chetan Pandaranath was actually supposed to be here instead of me giving this talk. So I'm definitely a filler, a very last-minute one. And unfortunately, he couldn't make it. Huge disclaimer. And if someone had told me before I signed up for this organizational duty that we would also be backups for speakers, anyway. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about agent-based models for motor control and social behavior. And I'm going to advance my slides with this. The point of view that we're taking for modeling these two different processes are very similar, even though, of course, motor control and social behavior are very different. But I'll just kind of go over our general point of view for goal-driven modeling in general. So for modeling motor pathways here, the first part of my talk, of course, is going to be sensory motor control, and the second is social behavior. So in the first part here, we're really modeling the process of movement generation through this goal-driven perspective. So what does that mean? We essentially aim to emulate specific brain regions by providing the model the same inputs and outputs as the brain regions in question, as well as constraints. And so what should we consider the goal of the motor pathways? Of course, it's to create movement, but the emulation of the task that the motor cortex performs really needs the body in the loop, as we tried to kind of really hone in on in the introduction, in the opening remarks. We are really concerned, or we really care about the interplay between the environment, the body, and the brain itself. And so to understand motor pathways, we kind of have to zoom out. We have to try to really concentrate on the fact that the motor cortex does not work in a silo. It receives constant feedback, including visual and proprioceptive. And really, the end movement is always achieved through the musculoskeletal system, through this entire dynamical system. It's a physical system with dynamics, its own dynamics, with inertia, own biomechanics. And so modeling that really makes sense for specifically modeling motor control. And so that's the kind of point of view we're taking. And the motor pathways, we're really thinking of them as a controller for the musculoskeletal system to achieve desired behavior, to achieve desired movements. Now, does this viewpoint actually help us understand the neuron's activities better? This is what we tried to show in a recent paper. And of course, this idea has been around for a long time, right? This point of view also has been talked about through optimal feedback control in the motor control literature. And it is a straightforward formulation in an idealized setting where the muscles are linear and the actual feedback control policies might be optimal. But this picture is not really informed by the anatomy of either the biomechanics or the actual brain. And so, if we want to change things, if we want to understand the system better, we really need to build in constraints that are informed by anatomy. And so to better model this end-to-end process, we really have to build in the details of the musculoskeletal system. We have to build in constraints where this picture of the brain goes. And that's what we tried to show again in a recent paper. We also really lay out this point of view in a review paper on embodied control, so please give that a read. And this is sort of, again, the point of view that we're taking in a lab for motor control. And why is this, the point of view also is that, well, we're really modeling the body very well. So this, for example, is a musculoskeletal model in Mojoko that is being driven through the muscle activity, and the muscle activity, the muscle excitations are being learned and being driven by, in this case, a recurrent neural network that is all of this, that is taking in sensory feedback, including proprioceptive feedback. And so, and this whole thing is being trained through usually deep reinforcement learning. This RNN, as I said, now can be, the RNN that is trained now can be examined further. And we find, interestingly, neural manifolds, as Juan has very nicely set up. And this really is aiming to provide an instantiation of what the brain is doing. And so unpacking why these neural manifolds exist and how we can understand them better is one of the goals of this. What we find through this framework is that the recurrent neural network's activity can really can recreate population structure in the motor cortex, and also provides neural decoding, which was really helpful. This framework is a feedback-driven framework, and so if the actual movements are perturbed, it can actually react to perturbations, which is very important when looking at real-time movements. And then the importance of muscle dynamics is something we also consider. Muscle dynamics, just as a finding, are really very useful to build into the structure. And the structure of the node's activity changes a lot. Changes a lot if you don't have the muscle dynamics built in. We also, very nicely set up by Juan, we also find orthogonality between the proprietary and movement subspaces in the manifold space, which it's quite difficult to get networks to actually have that property or that feature if you don't have embodiment built in. Okay, so from that, where are we now going? We're actually looking at a little more cognitive understanding of motor control. So this brings me to compositionality. And I like to include my kids in my talks when I travel. So this is my 3.5-year-old. He's really obsessed with Lego right now. And just to try to unpack what compositionality means to me, it essentially refers to the ability to take a set of tasks and boil it down to its building blocks, and really reuse the computational primitives to do something different or new. So in this Lego example, he's really just building a donut truck in this case, which he's obsessed with right now. But he's, how is he building it? Well, the donut truck is being built through these Lego blocks, which can be broken down. As I said, the Lego truck can be broken down into its building blocks and then used to build something new. In this case, that pair or house. And these are the computational primitives that are being used to build new tasks. Okay, so how does this actually relate to us? Well, people actually have studied compositionality in the cognitive tasks, and we see modularity at the level of units, the use of similar dynamical features as fixed points across tasks. But how do these concepts translate to the motor world? How do we perform multiple movements, multiple types of movements? Is quite a bit more complicated. What would we expect from different brain regions performing these types of movements? So what we wanted to understand is how compositionality might be taking place during motor tasks. So the output of the network is in this case now, is the muscle excitations needed in order to achieve movement, also through a biomechanical arm. But this is now supervised training. We're using MotorNet, which is a framework that everyone is free to use, and this is all work by John Lazzari, who's presenting a poster tomorrow, so you should totally go check that out for more details. But he's trained, in this case, 10 different tasks through 5 different speeds, as well as setting it up such that we actually see preparation versus execution, just as, again, Juan nicely set up. Okay, so we can train this model, and now the idea is to try to understand how the model, the recurrent neural network in this case, is actually performing these tasks. Is there compositional structure that's being built up? That means, are there computational primitives that are being built up? Okay, so he trains these. The model trains, otherwise I would not be here talking about this. But these are all successfully trained. Okay, and what do we mean by compositionality in this case? Again, this is one example of it, that we were trying to understand whether this network actually has some kind of an algebraic representation of the tasks in its activity. So to determine this, we looked at the principal component space of the network to visualize if there's any discernible structure or organization, and we see very clearly that the network is actually organized in a way that that basically separates out the kinematic complexity of the movement versus the direction of rotation in its two first principal components. And of course, these are by definition orthogonal. This kind of a structure allows for the reuse and the recombination of these axes to create new movements. And this is true for both the simple movements, simple extensions in this case, and the extension retractions, which are another kind of movement that was built up. Okay, how do we test this specific idea out? We can create a new movement, in fact, by not touching the recurrent weights that are actually in the network, but reusing the input weights to create different types of movements. So here, if we have trained the network for 3 different tasks, can we understand how these are being put together to actually create a new task by just looking at retraining the input weights themselves. And that's a test of this algebraic representation that is being built up in this network. It's more or less true for different movements, so some movements are a little bit more tricky to actually have in here, so that's why this works for some movements better than others. But more or less, we see that specific structure being built up. The other definition or the other understanding of compositionality that one might have, we can ask whether we can make arbitrary compound movements out of the set that are seen by the network. So here we wanted to extend, for example, a movement with one trajectory and then retract it with another. So reach in one way when we're getting to our target and retract it in another way. And the network hasn't been trained to actually do these kinds of different tasks, extend with one and retract with another. So how do we best do that? We can just change the rule input, in this case, to the network, and it actually does this specific kind of compositionality very easily through just that one input. And this points also to the fact that these movements can be broken into their subparts very effectively and recruited just by a simple input. So it points to very efficient use in the network space. Now, I want to point out that motor compositionality is a more complicated setting than pure cognitive compositionality, since distinct muscle activity is actually necessary to create the movements. And so how is the network activity organized as compared to the muscle activity, something we can try to get at in these networks. Really, the thing we're trying to show here, it's a very complicated slide, but that the muscle space has to be, by definition, very different than the network space. So here, the muscle activity has to lie in the same subspace, even when creating very different movements. And we quantify that using subspace angles. So here, the subspace angles for the muscle space are very small because they need to lie in the same subspace, because there's actually something driving the movements. The biomechanical arm is driving the movements in the same space, right? We're all operating in 3D, or in this case, 2D space. And so, these angles necessarily have to be small, which means they're in the same subspace. However, their activity itself needs to be very different, and we're quantifying that using disparity. So the disparity between different trajectories, if that's large, that means that their activity is very much very different. So in this small example, you can see that there are two tasks represented in here, orange versus black, and you can see that even if you try to align them as best as possible by rotating, translating, et cetera, they cannot be aligned very well. And so that's what is being quantified by the high disparity, that even if you try to align these two different trajectories, very difficult to align. However, in the network space, we actually do need a little more structure, or we expect a little more structure. And so in the network space, we need to recruit these muscles in the optimal way possible to create these new trajectories. And potentially, as I pointed out earlier, there is compositionality taking place. So this algebraic representation has to be present somehow. And so how is that done? We posit that basically the activity itself, the trajectories themselves lie in different subspaces and potentially in different manifolds, but they need to So how do we quantify that? The angle distributions, in fact, are quite different for the network. However, they need to be quite similar in their trajectories themselves, and that is when optimally aligned. So think two different manifolds, but they are actually quite similar when trying to understand their activity together. And so this is an organization in the network that actually supports or aids compositionality, that their trajectories are somewhat similar while being in separate manifolds. And that is how these computations might be happening. We also, and the previous quantifications were all static in nature. They didn't actually take into account the dynamics in the recurrent neural network. But we can also perform sort of more dynamical analyses. And this is one example. The actual structure in the fixed points across tasks is very similar in the network across, again, different similar tasks. So we see that these are just representations, but there's also a bioarchive paper for those who want to dig in a bit deeper, as well as, of course, John's poster, which is going to be tomorrow. And these dynamical features, again, are very similar, even though the dynamics might be happening in different manifolds themselves or different subspaces. Okay, now why is this useful, right? I'm an engineer by training. I always ask about, yes, this representation might exist, but how can it help? What can it be used for? And really, by leveraging this structure in the networks, we can perform completely new tasks that are not previously trained at all. We can perform completely new tasks by just retraining the inputs themselves and really keeping the rest of the network completely frozen. And that really helps us perform multiple tasks very efficiently. So how do we do this? Well, we train everything except we train for all the tasks while leaving behind some of the tasks that we already had. And we see that this sort of compositional structure really helps us create new movements with existing structure in the networks themselves. And so we are excited also to see how this might translate to more complex settings, as was asked by Zach. How do we actually not do, not just reaches, but very complex movements? And you'll see an example of where we're going with that for very complex pre-capture movements in Jeff's talk. Jeff Walker is giving a talk tomorrow to really understand very naturalistic movements, and that's an open question that would be super interesting to analyze. Okay, so this was the end of the first part of my talk, where we're looking at agent-based modeling to probe multitask representations. And another line of work by another student whose poster you'll see tomorrow is really trying to build in the anatomical structure that is important for distributed computations. That is, for example, being performed in the cerebellum in the brain to really understand where the internal models that are present in our brain might be actually taking place, and to build in those constraints from bottom up. So please go to her poster too. Okay, so now to the second part of my talk. How do we understand situations that are much more complex than pure reaches or more stereotyped movements? And we got interested in social processes, social behavior. Very different from motor control. There's not as many constraints. You don't know what the movements are for. It's very cognitive, and it's for that reason very complex. So here, for example, we see a video of a wolf pack. Of course, you have to consider their exact movements, this locomotion in this case. But the more interesting behavior that might be happening is how they coordinate their activity in order to catch this hare just spoiler alert, the hare does not make it. But they are sort of working together, very implicitly, potentially, but synchronizing their activity and kind of coordinating their activity in order to trap this hare. Again, very complex in its activity, and social behavior itself is actually very difficult to to even understand from bottom up. If you look at these videos, it's hard to pinpoint what motifs are there, for example, in the behavior. But what we're trying to model is also the goal of these animals. And so we're taking a stab at modeling social behaviors from a task-driven perspective. I'm showing you how these behaviors are kind of carried out in the lab. So here, there's one example of competition versus two examples of cooperation versus just kind of pro-social behavior. And we're really trying to understand across species how social behavior might be performed. So here, specifically for this talk, I'm going to be talking about cooperation in rats, but we're taking the same perspective for marmosets and competition for mice themselves. Okay, so here what you see, just to describe the experiments a little bit better, there is a laser pointer. Okay, here what we see are two rats pressing levers at the same time in order to get a reward that is on the other end. And there is a lever that is being put out. They have to press it in a very short interval in order to get the reward. Okay, so they're cooperating. We see that they are performing the behavior pretty well, even though there are some barriers in this task, as you can see. So we wanted to model this kind of cooperative behavior in a task-driven perspective, and this is Amelia Johnson's work, who also has a poster tomorrow that you should go check out for more details. But here we're training agents in order to perform this behavior. So this is multi-agent reinforcement learning for task training, where we have two different agents with their own actors and critic networks that are taking in sensory and task feedback and producing the actions of the next step, the next time step, in order to achieve cooperative behavior. They receive the same rewards as the rats receive in order for these networks to be trained. And the feedback consists of their own location, their reward's location, as well as gaze. And so at a gaze is when they're able to actually see what the location of the other agent is. And why is gaze so important? Or why is it built in the very front and center? In the experiments, they tried to block the gaze itself by putting opaque barriers between the two rats, and they really saw a difference in the level of cooperation that the rats could achieve. It sounds very straightforward. Of course, if you can't see the other agent, you would cooperate less, but here we can quantify how much less. And so we built in these gaze actions that basically were able to, in an active way, try to understand where the location of the other rat is. Okay, so this is where Amelia started, but this kind of assumption of the critics being centralized, where they actually get information about both rats at all times, is something we wanted to break, again, given the importance of gaze itself. And so we're moving now to an independent actor-critic framework with this partial observability of the gaze. And so now what do we, so now these critics this is one agent itself. These critics do not actually share any information at all. And what the key idea in this work that we're achieving is really trying to build in an internal model of the other agent that will actually be able to achieve the interaction, that will be able to achieve model of how the other agent is performing while it's being trained. And so this kind of mirrors the neural perspective, where we do believe there is an internal model, a social model of the world, and that means a model of what anyone else is going to do at any time. And so with the addition of this social model, this internal model, we actually see, just in terms of learning, we see more consistent learning of this cooperative behavior than if we don't have that internal model. And this, again, mirrors processes in the cerebellum as well as the social network in the brain that can achieve these cooperation. Okay, so these are the agents that we're actually training. Very simple point actors instead of the embodied motor control agents that I was showing earlier. But they are able to achieve this cooperation in a very similar way as the rats. And so these are the rodents' learning curves, if you want, how they actually train for cooperation. And we're able to achieve even in the model, similar trends as to how this behavior is being achieved through trial and error. Okay, so with that, what can we actually say about, and we're also able to do this in a much more realistic way. That is, if the barriers, if the visual access is obfuscated, we're also not able to learn as well, which is very natural, and that's also what we see in experiments. But what are we able to say about the behavior itself? And in fact, these models, now that they're trained this way, really replicate animal behavior or behavioral strategies that we see in the rats. And so what the rats end up doing is synchronizing their activity, which makes sense. That is one of the almost optimal behaviors to get at, to be able to get the most rewards possible. And so the rats end up synchronizing their activity across time. And if this is how many trials they have performed, they're synchronizing their activity more and more. The distance between them in the horizontal direction is decreasing. And that's exactly what we see in the model itself as well. They're synchronizing, they're getting to this optimal behavior or behavioral strategy itself. And they're also, in the rats, they're also ending up waiting as, again, an example of behavioral strategy in order to get more rewards, end up waiting, two rats end up waiting at the same time. And that's exactly what we're seeing in the models as well. And with that, now, of course, we can also examine the network's activity to get at what is happening in social parts of the brain, as well as the intent signals that might be present. We also, interestingly, this idea was inspired partly by this finding that unfamiliar rats cannot actually perform this behavior, this cooperative behavior as well, even though they know the task, but they don't know each other. They can't perform this cooperative behavior as well. And so through the specific embedding or this internal social model, we can also replicate that kind of finding. Okay, so I took you through our takes on agent-based modeling for motor control, where we're really focusing a lot on the body, on the point of the musculoskeletal model specifically, in order to understand multitasking and soon more naturalistic behavior. And we're also looking at point actors for multi-agent social behavior itself. Wouldn't the dream be to combine these two? So that's exactly where we're going. We're trying to understand how these two interplay together to get at embodied social behavior, because of course the effect of the body really does make a difference when we're looking at cooperation or any kinds of social behavior. If you make small gestures, they're picked up by the other person. So we're trying to capture all of these instances. Okay, with that, thank you for your attention, and definitely check out the posters as well as Jeff's talk tomorrow. And thank you for the other two organizers for putting together this symposium, but all of you for actually attending and being here. Thank you.